like to begin by thanking the delegates once again for the opportunity of being at the Northern Housing Conference. I appreciate the chance each time I'm invited to come back and to work with the communities again. I look out this morning and I see a lot of really good, strong housing experience in the room, and I take my hat off to that because that's what this is all about, is developing the capacity in our community to take care of our own people. So thank you all very much for being here on time this morning. As Grace has mentioned, my name is Roxanne Harper. For those who do not know me, I am a band member in Illground First Nation, which is located in the central part of the province of New Brunswick, and this is my 29th year in Aboriginal housing. And I say that with a lot of pride because I have found this to be the most amazing career one could ever have had working in this industry, serving our people. For those of you new to the housing industry, welcome aboard. There's never been a better time to be working for our own people than there is right now. The topic this morning is about the true cost of housing, and I'm not just here today to talk to you about dollars and cents, but to talk to you about how housing impacts and shapes our communities. Hopefully I'll be okay with the technical side of this. Oh, look, it's so easy. What I'd like to ask you to think about is to consider for a moment back home in your community, what does it cost to build a home? That's one side of housing. The other thing I need you to think about is what does it cost to manage a home? And there are experts in the room who have a background in the construction side of housing or the planning side of housing who can tell you what it costs to build the home. And there are property managers who can tell you what it costs to manage a home. But the other thing we all have to shift our attention to is what does it cost not to manage a home? And that really has become a question that has fascinated me greatly in recent years, because I find in my career with housing, we have definitely improved on the side of building and construction. We have definitely begun to move forward with property management, but we still have to discuss what happens back home when we do not manage the assets that are put on the ground. And that's really, for me, the most important question of all. So let's start with the first question of what does it cost to build a home? So I'm looking for some help here in the room. What is the average building cost of a 3-bedroom home in Northern Ontario? Bernard, help me out here. Good morning. What's the average building cost in Arrowland? 3-bedroom, please. 100 and what? 100 to 125. Wow, that's a pretty efficient building practice. Okay, who else? Batchewana's in the room. Do you have a number for me? 140, okay. Anyone else? 175. So we're looking at 125, 140, 175. Let's split the difference and say we're coming in at about $150,000 to build a 3-bedroom house on reserve in Northern Ontario. If that home that you just built is owned by the First Nation, then the financing becomes the responsibility of the band. So when First Nations build a home, they have a couple of options they usually consider. Quite often they use any INAC subsidies that are available to the band as part of the contribution of building that house. Many First Nations apply for the use of the CMHC Section 95 program, which of course brings an ongoing subsidy to help cover some of the operating cost. And of course, First Nations contribute their own funds to building these homes. And that's the area that always kind of interests me, is because I'm always asking First Nations is, where do you get the money? If you're not borrowing the money, where's the band getting the money? And a lot of First Nations will use their own source revenue or use portions of their band-based capital. And some First Nations have actually gone out and borrowed additional money to build homes. And that's great. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing any of those approaches or a combination of those approaches to actually get the house on the ground. But the thing that I have to remind us all today is that is the easy part of housing, is actually getting the house on the ground. And the construction and the purchase cost are a one-time cost and only a part of the true cost of housing on our reserves. So the second question is, what is the cost to manage a home? Well, it basically comes down to two things on reserve. We have expenses and we have revenues. And if you look at the slide here, you will see that most often there are significantly more expenses than there are revenues with a housing project. So here we have the loan repayment, the insurance, maintenance, repairs, funding of a replacement reserve fund, and I'll just speak to that for one moment. Some people think a replacement reserve fund is only for Section 95 or the CMHC units. I will tell you here today, a replacement reserve fund should be mandatory for every house that we put on the ground back home. This is money that we set aside for future repairs that will happen. It's about protecting the homes that we're building. So it's not just for the CMHC programs. It should be for every program you build. You should also put under your expenses a contingency budget. Contingencies are for unforeseen expenses, which all of us in housing encounter. And then, of course, we should always budget for our administration. We have to plan to have the staff resources in place to actually protect the units and to provide the services that our people deserve to have provided to them. So the expenses can be lengthy when we start to look at this column. Then we move over to look at the revenues that are associated with managing the homes. And so the first thing that I've listed here is a First Nations contribution. And a lot of times people say to me, well, what is that? And what I say to you today is almost every one of you is already contributing to housing in your community. Sometimes I refer to it as a First Nation subsidy, and that's usually when the band recognizes that the expenses exceed the revenue and they have to top it up. Most First Nations will top up their own housing programs, and what I'm recommending to you is if you're doing that, you need to budget for it, and also I would take a bow and take credit for it. If I was a First Nation community right now subsidizing my housing programs and services, I would say we, the First Nation, contribute to affordable housing for our members, and I would start planning a housing subsidy coming from the band, which I find fascinating, and this is not a criticism of CMHC, because everybody knows, I mean, CMHC does a lot of great work in our communities, but all too often we give credit to them for our affordable housing programs. We say that's a CMHC home, or we get a CMHC subsidy. And in my experience, many First Nations are contributing as much or more than the CMHC subsidy to their own housing programs and services. Another revenue which is gaining in popularity across the country is the use of a rental regime or a maintenance fee. A lot of First Nations now across the country are beginning to charge and collect for the use of the home. That is generating an additional revenue that can be reinvested back into the housing programs. And of course, if this is the CMHC Section 95 program, which is the only program that comes with an ongoing subsidy, so it should be something you factor into your revenues because you can count on that subsidy as long as you're in compliance with the program. So as you can see, there are three possible sources of revenues with a house. But unfortunately, there are usually more expenses than there are revenues. When a home is managed, and a lot of people say, you know, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of money, and I get all that, but it's also a great return on the investment that we make in our communities. So when a home is properly managed, it protects people and property. So we not only protect the people who get to live in the home, but we protect the entire First Nation by knowing that we continue to make an investment in our own people and provide adequate, suitable, and affordable housing that does make a difference at the community level. We also can balance our revenues and our expenses. And what we see often in some communities is the balance is tilted. We often have more expenses than we do revenues. So by managing your properties, you can restore balance to the community. When a house is managed, we're also able to follow a property management plan, which is a plan where we sit down and we forecast what we need to do to protect the millions of dollars that are tied up in housing out there in each of our communities. And we're not just talking one or two houses. I look out here in the room and a lot of you I recognize and I know your communities, and I can tell you, you are responsible for managing a multi-million-dollar operation. And we need to be managing it properly by having things like plans and policies. I see you looking at each other saying, yeah, is that true? It is true, okay? Make no mistake, we are property managers worth millions of dollars in Indian country. We also can plan for future housing projects. And I know that sometimes in a day-to-day we get so caught up in the existing portfolio and planning for it today that we don't always take time to think about the future. But if we are managing the assets today, we can begin to plan for tomorrow. Because the needs in our communities are changing, our demographics are changing, and our housing programs need to change as well. And of course, a home that is well managed increases the satisfaction of the tenants, the administration, and the leadership. And I do believe that's something that all of us need to strive for, is improving how people understand and receive their housing programs and increasing the satisfaction of people in our community. All too often people express anger or dissatisfaction over living conditions. And we have to be honest that sometimes it goes back to the fact that the properties are not being managed properly. So we as housing providers need to accept our share of the responsibility and the workload that has to happen. And yeah, it is time consuming and it is expensive. But I want to answer the third question now, is what is the cost of not managing a home? And I can't put a dollar figure on it, but I can tell you it would prove to be significant. The cost of not managing goes way beyond the dollars and the cents that are involved. It is not just a financial issue. When we don't manage our properties and we begin to run out of money, we start using non-housing revenues to actually cover housing expenses. And I wouldn't be so bold as to ask you to raise your hand if you've ever had to do this, because we all know we've been there. If we don't have enough money to cover the housing expenses, we start borrowing money from other programs and services. We start using own source revenue, and there's nothing wrong with that, but that isn't always what we should be doing. A housing deficit will happen when your expenses exceed your revenues. And a housing deficit for too many First Nation communities becomes a reality and becomes a burden that we must carry, not for just today, but into future generations. Homes are not maintained to an acceptable standard. And I always find that a little bit disheartening when I look at the fact that we build brand new homes on reserve, but we don't always maintain those homes to an acceptable standard. And I would like to say that in my 29 years of housing experience, we've gone from building very substandard homes to building some of the best houses in Canada. The homes that we build today start off meeting the minimum of the building codes, but we don't always maintain that level. And that's unfortunate. So if a home isn't maintained, it begins to deteriorate incredibly quick. Lack of maintenance today becomes an incredibly costly expense tomorrow. It also increases the dissatisfaction or frustration of our tenants. It also increases the stress level for the staff and our leadership, and of course other parts of the administration. But one of the most frightening costs that we have to pay is it limits any future housing starts. The cost of the current portfolio not being managed today has actually prevented a lot of First Nations from moving forward. Just quickly, I mean, forget that CMHC sitting here in the room, but raise your hand if you have a waiting list back home. Who's looking for housing? Yeah. And you know what's interesting about that waiting list is we all have one. There's nothing wrong with having one as long as we're chipping away at it. But a lot of First Nations have a waiting list that grows every year for either new housing or repairs and renovations. And a lot of First Nations also go for periods of time without any new construction. That, after a while, begins to cost the community much more than just dollars and cents, because we all know that it contributes to other challenges that we have to deal with back home. So when we think about managing versus not managing, it's a good question of which is more affordable to us. The decision, and I have to say this with all honesty to you, the decision to manage your portfolio is a decision that is made by your First Nation. I get it that it's easier sometimes to say other people outside of our community are responsible for the situation that we're in. But we choose how we manage our housing programs and services. My opinion and my strong belief today, and some of you have heard me say it more than once, but housing is a business, and we need to start acting like that. We need to run this department as if it's important to balance our revenues and our expenses, and all housing costs need to start being considered back home. We need to think about what was the cost of construction, what was the cost of infrastructure into our communities, what is the cost of property management, and there's almost this little hidden expenditure in many communities. How much are emergencies costing us? And a lot of First Nations tell me that they're spending a ton of money on emergencies, and when I say to them, well, what's an emergency? Many bands are stumped for a definition of what is an emergency. And my advice to you is to take a look at what do we really consider to be emergency expenditures and how are we going to finance them? And whose emergency is it? We also have to look at the resources that a First Nation can contribute to housing. You know, as a First Nations woman, I'm pleased that many bands want to offer their members affordable housing solutions. And I get that, how important it is to make sure that housing is affordable. But I have to remind us that housing must also be affordable to the community. So if this is a situation and I am a property manager and Grace Martineau here sitting beside me is my tenant, I'm trying to offer her good value, but I also have to make sure that in my attempts to offer her good value is not costing the rest of the community. So we need to think about affordability for the band and the occupant as well. And we need to sit down and have an honest discussion about how much can the First Nation contribute to this program. In many communities, we are contributing almost 100% of all costs associated with the homes. Perhaps it's time to look at a new approach. Perhaps it's time to honestly talk about what can the tenant contribute. And in my example here, I am talking rental housing where the band is a landlord and the owner of the property, and the tenant, the individual who lives in the home, becomes our tenant with their own set of responsibilities. Maybe it's time to start having more and more of a discussion about what are their responsibilities, what are our expectations of our own people. And then, of course, we have to consider, is our current approach sustainable? And if not, what can we do? We're looking for economic sustainability. And economic sustainability happens when the housing programs and services are able to stand on their own, when the revenues coming in are sufficient to cover the expenses going out. So I said previously that housing is a business. And if you believe that, then it means you also believe we can change how we do business. And I think it's time for a new approach. First Nations, as the owner of the rental properties, has an obligation to manage those properties and protect its investment in housing. So we're talking about millions of dollars worth of assets, which means we as property managers have an obligation to protect what is probably the third greatest asset that the First Nation has. The first greatest asset we have as First Nations people, of course, is our membership. Second to that is probably our land base of which we come from. But follow the money. Where all the money is at today is almost always in our housing programs and services. So we have an obligation to protect the investment of millions of dollars that's being made. So as First Nations, we choose how to manage our programs. We choose whether we want to be a business or not. My advice to bands is to choose to become a non-profit housing corporation. So we evolve into being non-profit, and non-profit doesn't mean we're going crazy and raising the rents just to make money. It means we're looking at a design that allows the band to be economically sustainable and to generate enough money in our housing programs to cover our current housing portfolio and to plan for future generations. So if we used a nonprofit approach, basically we would begin to balance our resources. The other thing that it might do, of course, with a nonprofit approach, you would need strict housing policies and procedures. And I believe if we were to have policies and procedures in place, we would also balance the community. Because I travel all over Canada, and I've been to many, many First Nation communities, and I often see a community that is out of balance. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to any of the communities that are here, but in many First Nations communities, we see some people who have a lot and some people who have nothing. And through a housing approach, we can begin to restore the balance by looking at how we create a program that is economically sustainable and provides services to the majority of our people. And of course, if we ran it like a business, did I not change that? Sorry, I'm falling behind. The occupants can be responsible to also share in the responsibility for housing. And I always believed if you expect more from your people, you will get more. I think we have done a huge disservice in many communities, especially in regards to the area of housing, by building brand new homes, choosing people to move into those homes, and having very little expectation of our people. And I think it is time to change that relationship and expect more from the people who are living in the homes. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. And I get it that in many communities we've always done business the same way. And now here's people are starting to say, well, can we change it? We can change it, but it's not an easy approach. Many of the communities in this room now have already changed the relationship with their occupants. And if you have already done that, then perhaps it's time to increase the responsibility of your occupants and therefore decrease the responsibilities of the bands. But when it comes to the true cost of housing, we have to prove to people how much these programs and services are really costing. Most people have no understanding or comprehension of the cost of these programs. And I would be willing to bet if I went to a couple of your communities, most people would argue with me that it does not cost $150,000 to build a home. It's probably a lot less than the management cost. They would probably say, no, that's not true. It doesn't cost that much because nobody does anything for me. I think we need to start telling our story in housing, and to do that, we have to first decide how financial responsibilities will be shared. Who is going to be responsible for what? And that is between the First Nation and the tenants. We need to start utilizing housing agreements that define roles and responsibilities, and that especially detail cost and obligations. So who is responsible for which aspect of that home? We also need to inform our tenants how our payments are being calculated, and if your band is providing any contribution to the ongoing cost of those homes, you need to start identifying that as a First Nations housing subsidy, and you need to start taking credit for it. And an example of that might be, and let's just assume for a minute that we had a 3-bedroom house and its monthly operating costs, and I'll just round these off, is $800 a month. And let's assume that that house is under the CMHC housing program. So we get from CMHC a monthly subsidy. Let's just say hypothetically it's $350 a month. So if our operating cost was $800 and we get a federal government subsidy of $350, that leaves me with the balance of what? $450? Geez, I'm real bad at math, that's why I don't go to bingo. So out of the $450 a month, we charge the tenant, let's say hypothetically $300 a month is what the tenant pays in rent. There's still $150 here in the operating cost that's unaccounted for, but it is being paid. That's why I'm calling that a First Nations housing subsidy. So I would add to the lease agreement that I signed with my tenant Grace, I put an addendum on the back of the lease agreement saying to Grace, by the way, the monthly operating costs for the home you're renting from the band, oh, and by the way, you need to talk tenure. So I would constantly say to Grace, you are a tenant, I am representing the landlord, you are renting this home. I keep thinking I'm going to come out with a column called Tenure Talk. I think that'd be a really great advice column. But no, it's true, because sometimes we say to Grace, the house you own, if Grace is a rental client, she does not own that home. She is a tenant, and I need to tell her about her responsibilities. So I would put an addendum on that lease agreement saying that, Grace, your house is costing $800 a month. You contribute $300, the federal government contributes $350 a month, the First Nation contributes on your behalf the balance of $150 to allow you to access affordable rental accommodations. And the reason I would say it just that way is I think it's time for our communities to take credit for offering affordable housing to our people. We don't take enough credit for our contributions into the housing programs. And I think if I was to do that, and if I was to counsel Grace like that each and every year when we renewed her rental agreement, then Grace would start to understand that she's receiving very good value. Because where else in the country could Grace rent a 3-bedroom, usually quite new home for $300 a month? I dare you to find me another landlord who can offer housing at such an affordable rate as First Nations. I have not seen it in my career, but if you know about it, I'd be very interested in hearing about that example. So I would then develop an annual operating budget and a plan to increase rents. And this sounds crazy, but I can tell you again what I'm hearing across the country, and I heard it just a couple of weeks ago here in Ontario, where First Nations were gathered in a room for a 2-day training session, and the conversation has now gone from should we charge rent to should we increase rents. First Nations are beginning to comprehend that this is a business, and part of running a business means at some point in time we will have to raise the rents. You know, in a business you have 2 choices. You either charge more for your product or you cut back on your product. I do not recommend that we cut back on maintenance and repairs and protecting our existing portfolio. So in many First Nation communities, we have very few options but to look at increasing revenues. And part of that may be I have to raise Grace's rent from $300 to $325. So our policies and our plans should always allow us the opportunity to do that. I also need to have qualified staff to manage the portfolio. And again, I have millions of dollars worth of band-owned assets, and it continues to amaze me how many First Nation communities have 1 or no staff protecting the 3rd greatest asset that the First Nation owns. If housing is a business, we have to invest in our own business, and we have to hire qualified people to protect the investment. Those people not only protect the investment, but they also provide a service to our members in ensuring that they understand and accept their housing responsibilities. So there's an area of education that we have to explore more in regards to the management of the asset. We also have to begin to report more frequently to our leadership, to go back to our chief and council on a regular basis and tell them about the current housing portfolio. How many units are under administration? What is the estimated value of the property? What is the life expectancy of the property? What are the challenges we're dealing with as property managers? How many more homes do we need in the community? And what's our plan for getting there? We need to maintain greater communications with our leadership, and we need to begin to expand their understanding of housing programs and services as well. But of course, we also have an obligation to go back to our membership and continue to remind them of what needs to be done to protect both people and property. And that's really what starts to happen when we tell the truth about the real cost of our housing programs and services. And I will argue that we need to keep the membership informed, because whenever we talk about the real cost of programs, it implies that if we're going to improve things, we're going to have policies and procedures. And that also then implies, if we have policies, that there will be consequences. When somebody breaks the policy in our communities, there will be consequences. There will be casualties lost to the housing policies and procedures. We will have to defend our process. And of course, the best way of defending the process is by making sure the membership understands, is informed, and aware of the cost of what housing really is to our communities. We should also, in terms of managing the portfolio, conduct regular home visits to all properties that are under administration. And again, I recognize that we don't always have the staff resources to do this, but in a perfect world, as a property manager, you should be entering the rental units a minimum of once a year. But let me go back to my example where Grace is my tenant. If Grace is a new tenant, I, as the landlord, should reserve the right to visit that home 3 or 4 times in the first year. Why? Because I want to be sure that Grace doesn't have a problem or doesn't misunderstand her obligations. If she doesn't understand what she's supposed to be doing, then I need to catch that in the first few months of occupancy before a small item like something that's being neglected becomes a very costly repair. So we need to be more involved with our tenants, more front and center with our tenants, and working with them on a regular basis. We also have to continue to share information through workshops, information sessions, social media. You be old-fashioned, have a newsletter, whatever it takes to get the word out to our communities that the housing department is running a business. And I think sometimes what happens in our communities, and I think all of us are guilty of this, including myself, when we work back home, we know everybody. That means everyone who comes into your office, you've probably known all your life. I understand that because my community is no different. So the people that we work with are either people that we care about, we know, we love, and sometimes people we don't like so much. So it can get very emotional sometimes in housing. It's hard to run a business when things are getting emotional. But I have to remind you that your job as a property manager is to manage property. Whenever I respond to the emotion, I start managing people. And I have to be mindful that I manage properties. That's what my job is. I'm responsible for protecting millions of dollars worth of assets that the band owns, which means my housing policies and procedures will allow a tenant, if Grace is my tenant, it will allow her several opportunities to change her behavior. It will allow me, the landlord, several opportunities to work with her, to counsel her on her obligations, and to try and influence her behavior. But at the end of the day, Grace is an adult. She chooses her behavior. I choose whether or not I wish to work in housing, and if I've made the decision to work in housing, then I have to accept the responsibility of enforcing our policies and our procedures. And that means I manage the property. And I get it that that's easier said than done. And some of you are thinking, oh, it's real easy for you to say that from there, but you're not in my community. But I can tell you, I have worked your job. I know how difficult and challenging this can be, but I also remind you of the other side of the issue. I know how rewarding it can be when Grace, as the tenant, accepts her responsibility. And then when Grace, as the tenant, continues to do that. And she, whether she realizes it or not, she also continues to benefit and to teach other people how to accept their housing obligations. And we get stronger through each time we enforce this. But it's only done through communication and consistent enforcement. We need to increase how we share information on the true cost of housing programs and services. We need to go back home and think about every program and service. And, you know, most of my examples here, I've talked about the CMHC Section 95 program, but these basic principles apply to all housing programs that we are supporting in our community, whether they be band-owned housing, capital housing. And I laugh, some of you in the room even tell me you have a RAMA housing program. I don't care what you call your housing program, but I can tell you, however you're financing it or offering it or supporting it, you need to think about what is the cost of that. What are the cost of repairs, maintenance, insurance? What are the cost of emergency repairs? What are the cost of all these little deals that we make to people saying, yeah, don't worry about it, we'll take care of that. All of those things at the end of the day begin to cost the band. So we have to stop what we're doing now, take inventory of how we've been spending money, go back to our leadership, inform them of the true cost of housing programs and services. And it could be as simple as reminding them that it cost $150,000 to build a home, but the truth of the matter is it may be costing you $200,000 to $250,000 to manage that home over the lifetime of its mortgage. That's what we have to start focusing on. So we need to tell the chief and council about these programs, what they're costing us, and we need to come right out and ask our leadership if they feel there's a need to improve the economic sustainability of housing programs and services, and would they support a change in direction. If the leadership agrees with us that there should be a change, then we need to begin to consult our membership to gather their support and begin to revise our housing policies to make sure that policies support economic sustainability. We also have to take a look at our past practices. How have we done business in the past? How could we change it? And we can begin to decide what obligations will the tenant have. So we could, for instance, look at what costs need to be recovered. And I've seen some First Nations, primarily with band-owned units, build a brand new house and never expect any financial return from the occupant. If you can afford to do that, that's great, but you could also change your approach now. I've worked with a couple of First Nation communities. If they build a brand new band-owned home, they're establishing either at day one a rental regime, or they might say to the member, it's your house now, don't ever come back to us. You are responsible for all maintenance and repairs and all insurance on your home. So you need to define what that relationship is with your tenant and what cost you expect to begin to recover from the tenants. And you know, and though I didn't talk about it here, there's a bit of a hidden cost that a lot of us are dealing with too on reserve. And that's the cost of services to these homes. How many of you in this room right now, your band is providing water, sewer, and garbage pickup at no cost to the occupant? It's an interesting trend going on. Yeah, I get it that we get some funding from the federal government for that, but it is insufficient funding to cover the actual cost of that service. More and more bands are beginning to have the discussion on, should we be charging for services? What is the cost of delivering water, of garbage pickup, of the sewer systems that we're running? And you will, I'll tell you that right now, you're going to see a day where this becomes just a basic fee that we're starting to charge out in our communities, because it's a real cost to the band, and in many First Nations it is becoming a financial burden, and you have to ask the question, can we continue to offer these services without any income coming back from the occupants? So it's up to you to consider what cost your occupants will carry. It's up to our bands to develop our own budgets and our plans. And again, I would remind you, and I've said it once, I'll have to say it one more time, when you're planning a project, you should plan to increase the cost to the occupant. Why? Because the cost to the band increases over time. The cost to the occupant should be a shared responsibility, in my opinion. So I would actually sit down and I would start announcing to everybody, if we charge $300 a month rent now, we reserve the right to increase those rents annually. We will give sufficient notice to the occupants that we will be doing so, but rents can expect to increase. Our operating costs increase, so why wouldn't our revenues? We also have to make sure the policies and the administrative practices exist. You know, when I talk about the true cost of housing, in one way I'm saying we have to share the responsibility with the tenant. The tenant has to contribute. The tenant will only contribute if you develop the policies and the procedures that support that. And you know, I've been around Aboriginal housing for a long time, and in the first part of my career, a lot of First Nations used to tell me, oh, we can't get the tenants to pay rent. And then one day along the way I was looking at it and I thought, you know, one of the reasons you can't get tenants to pay rent is because we're not enforcing our policies and our procedures. We're not being the administration that we have to be to actually go out and collect those payments. You know, I have a mortgage. I'm not sure if I'd pay it willingly if I didn't think the bank wouldn't come and get me. So they will make me because they have policies and procedures in place. We need to do the same thing in our community. We need to make sure there's somebody at the band office to receive the payments. We need to make sure that we look at different alternatives for how a payment can be made. We need to have staff who can send out letters, knock on the doors, make the phone calls. These things will not happen on their own. We need to invest in the administration to make it happen. But we also have to consistently enforce our housing policies without exception. Consistently enforce those policies and procedures. We can't make allowances for people we like or don't like. We can't say, oh, well, you know, poor Grace, she lost her job, her dog got hit by a car, and she never wins that bingo. You know, this is a business I'm running. I still have a job that I have to do, so I have to work with Grace to figure out how she can make those payments, how she can sign a repayment agreement, and how she can continue to honor her responsibility to our community. I have to have real and enforceable consequences. And having been around housing as long as I have, I can tell you right now, you will not enforce any type of a cost-sharing approach unless there are consequences to the occupants. If an occupant chooses not to make their payment, whether it be rent, a renovation loan, or a mortgage payment, whatever the case may be, you need to have real and hard-hitting consequences. I cannot have any more idle threats. There needs to be something that the whole community sees happen so that they know the days of non-payment will end, and that we are serious about running a business in housing and serious about sharing that obligation with the tenant. And to do that, we must all, every one of us in this room, must strive to continue to educate our membership, our leadership, and our administration on the true cost of housing programs and services. And I think that part of it begins with how we talk, what we say. You know, a lot of people in this room still refer to their rental units as CMHC units. You need to take that out of your vocabulary. You need to say these are band-owned assets, these are rental units, and we are renting them out to tenants. You also need to stop calling tenants homeowners. You know, that's one thing that has always driven me crazy. All the time we say, Grace moved into that home, we gave her that home, and now she doesn't pay her rent. That sentence makes no sense at all. If she's the homeowner, she doesn't pay rent. A homeowner either owns the home or they have a mortgage on the home. We also need to stop saying to the tenants, hey, you're a homeowner. If they're not a homeowner, don't call them a homeowner. So you really need to define your tenure, you need to develop your policies, you need to manage your assets, and all of this comes back to the simple statement that housing is a business, and it should be a nonprofit operation. Questions? Okay, question at the back. Can you use your bingo voice? A board, so if you have like a housing authority, if you have a housing authority or a housing committee, it depends what you actually have running. A housing authority is an actually incorporated entity, which is generally, or should be, independent of the chief and council. Okay, so if you have an authority or if you have a housing committee, it's up to you at the community level to define what their responsibilities are. Now, I would have them championing and supporting housing policies and programs. I would probably limit how much involvement they had with the day-to-day management. So, you know, let's see, I see Earl Commanda sitting up here. If Earl and Frank Horn, if they were on my housing authority, well, bad choice, because I don't know if I'd want them two running around the community. Just a little housing humor, boys. But so you have to define what is their involvement, their responsibilities. Most First Nations use their boards or committees to help with planning, to help with policy development, to help with looking at what future housing projects we should be building in the community, studying demographics, like you might be looking at all the names you have on the waiting list and saying, what are the community demographics here? Recently, I worked with a housing committee who pulled every application they had. And there were many. There were like 100 applications on file. And what they were studying is what are the demographics and what are the household incomes. And because they're looking at the demographics, they're starting to realize that perhaps the band should stop building single-family, three-bedroom homes, because over 30% of the names on their waiting list were non-elderly singles, which was a very interesting demographic. The other thing that they noticed is that a lot of people on the waiting list were gainfully employed and probably could start looking at market-based housing. So oftentimes a housing committee or a housing authority can get involved in that level of planning back home. I would be reluctant to encourage them to take on any day-to-day property management, things like sending out letters, knocking on doors, etc. I believe that's why we need to have qualified housing staff so that they can manage the asset. Any other questions? Rose? I have not seen a housing tribunal, and I'm assuming that they would hear things like appeals, concerns raised. Yep. I've not seen one ever used anywhere in the country, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at it. I think it might be an interesting model because, again, it would be something based in the community. And I believe the more community involvement we can have, the better it is for us at the end of the day. But like all things, we'd have to clearly define what would be the role of the tribunal, who would be sitting as a member of that tribunal, and how far would their decisions or involvement go. And I think, of course, for a tribunal to be successful, it would also require us to have very good and effective housing policies and procedures and qualified staff to enforce those policies. But yeah, why not? I mean, a lot of bands are struggling with how to hear appeals. So they're looking at having an independent appeal committee. Some First Nations are beginning to use an arbitrator, who is a person completely independent of the First Nation, whose whole job is to just to look at the policies and procedures, to talk to the person launching the appeal and talk to the administration and just roll. So that's not a bad body either, but a tribunal would probably reflect your demographics, you know, and would probably have people who are very well trained on policies and procedures. And it might even be easier for our membership to accept the decision of a tribunal as opposed to an outsider. You know, I'd like to argue with you, Rose, but I can't. I mean, I'd like to, and honestly I would. Having been in your position in my own community, I can tell you that that is so unfortunate that we, as First Nations, do not value our own people and their knowledge enough. And that's heartbreaking. And I always laugh, and some of you may have heard me say this, you know, the further I get away from my own community, the smarter I am. Or it's the perception, isn't it? You know, when you think about it. If you come to my community, they'd say, holy, that Rose, she's so smart. And then they'd even say, why don't you listen to her? But, you know, the truth of the matter is, we all have a voice. We have to find our voices. We have to use our voices. There may be opportunities, and one opportunity that comes, you know, as I'm having this conversation with Rose, I immediately think of the North Shore Tribal Council. And I look around the room and I think a lot of us have tribal councils that we may or may not be affiliated with. But that's also a voice we need to start to have them speak louder and hopefully to be heard. So there may be opportunities for First Nations to actually bring in other people, such as your tribal council, to bring in Ontario First Nations Tech Services. You know, there is a wealth of knowledge out there that we're not always tapping, and I get it that sometimes we need an outsider to come to our communities and to shake things up. And it's interesting how I often say the exact same thing that your housing staff are saying, but you're hearing it differently, probably because I am an outsider. And I wish it wasn't true, but it is. You know, and on that note, I always recommend you need to start bringing your leadership, bringing your membership, whenever possible, to the message, or you take the message to the community. Mm-hmm. Any questions? Yes. Can you wait for the microphone to come to you? I can't hear you. You're too soft-spoken. I wish people would say that about me.
If we're going to start a market-based housing program, what type of positions do we need to have in place? Like you're talking, your committee and your council should maybe remain separate. You should have a housing manager. Like, do you need like qualified home inspectors? Do you who do you have to go in and inspect the home? But I don't know, like.
I wouldn't be so bold as to say, yes, you need an inspector because you're expanding into market-based housing. You know, you have to have enough work in your community to retain an inspector. And there are inspectors right now you can hire who are qualified to come out and do the inspections, whether it's for your band rental units or market-based housing units. So you will need an inspector to ensure that the properties are being built to the minimum of code. But I really don't think in most of our communities there's not enough volume to actually have a full-time inspector. What I would be having in this case is people who could explain what market-based housing means. People, and of course you're going to be, well, I shouldn't say of course because I don't know, but I'm assuming you're going to deal with a bank. So the banks would have their lending criteria and their loan officers. But your staff should be familiar and aware of what the lending criteria is and should understand what those mortgage documents are. And you should also be in a position where you have staff to help the occupants understand what those responsibilities are, especially if there's any defaults later on, to remind them of their obligations and to help them, if possible, to protect their interest. So whether that's a tenant relations officer or you evolve the role into something else for market-based housing, basically you need somebody there to explain, support, and help them make the decisions that need to be made. You know, your existing housing staff might be able to be pushed into going beyond the current housing programs now and accepting market-based responsibilities, but then you might need additional staff too. And I wish I could say there's a magic number out there. You know, like in the urban native housing programs, which some of us in this room are familiar with, there is a magic number about staffing. And it's like for every 75 units, we need one warm body. We don't have such a requirement on reserve, though we should. We should be able to say to manage a portfolio of this many units, some that are rentals, some that are home ownership, some that are market, some that are not market. These are the housing staff that we need, but there is no such a model to my understanding. But we definitely have to get serious about, do we have enough people protecting the investment? Earl? Earl, is this a question or are you going to answer?
Yeah, because I guess what we have is our council, our chief and council, and our housing committee. We have no additional housing staff overseeing anything, no bylaw enforcement officers. Like, it's all coming down to that housing committee. So at this point, so like what type of positions would you recommend maybe setting up in the future to keep them separated a little bit? Because you were talking about trying to keep them separated.
I think you need to think about retaining a housing manager or a housing coordinator. You know, and if your portfolio is small and just getting started, maybe it's not even a full-time position yet. You know, and there's nothing wrong with saying we're going to have a housing manager who works 3 days a week. You know, but I think you want to be really careful that we're not always putting our governments in a position where they're having to defend everything they're doing. And so if your chief and council are acting as your housing staff at the same time, it does put them in an awkward position. And I would also think your chief and council doesn't have the time to take on the day-to-day property management issues. So I would look at, and maybe just starting with a part-time position. Questions? Grace, you have a question?
I have a question. Could you provide a few examples for consequences for non-payment of rent? Because there are still many communities who are having a problem with evictions or who just can't seem to evict.
Well, you know, the first thing I always remind people of when we talk about consequences, the first thing we need to remember is whether or not you have consequences for non-payment, your community is suffering consequences. So if I go back to the example that Grace is my tenant and I represent the community as the landlord and I do not enforce policies on Grace, her behavior affects every one of us. So there's a community consequence. And when we understand there's a community consequence, it becomes a little easier for the community to implement a consequence to the individual. So if we look at the issue of non-payment, non-payment affects our communities because it limits our ability to cover our operating cost. It may limit our ability to retain qualified housing staff and to pay our people what they're worth. It may limit our ability to provide maintenance and repairs to the band-owned assets. And we are a landlord. We have a responsibility to maintain those assets. If we also have housing arrears, we're probably not planning future housing projects. And many First Nation communities have said to me, you know, we haven't built a home in 5 or 10 years because the cost of the current portfolio is a financial burden. And often it's because they're not collecting a fee from the occupants and having the occupants contribute. So the first thing to understanding consequences is to know how it's hurting your community. You know, and I would think that a lot of those things have happened in your community. They've happened in my community. It's life. That's housing. So when we know that, then we start explaining how non-payment affects the village and what should we do about it. And then we talk to our people, being our leadership and our membership, and we ask them, what's a viable consequence for non-payment? And I will tell everybody in this room that eviction is the very end of the road. It is the absolute last thing we do. We are housing providers in this room. Our obligation and our priorities are to house our people. We're not evictors. We're in housing. But make no mistake, if we have to do an eviction, we will. But before you go there, you should look in your housing policy to say, what other options do we have? Could we start with things like denying any further assistance? So if Grace doesn't want to pay her rent, can we shut down any other assistance offered at the band office, not just housing? So what other programs and services can we suspend now? So if we administer things like our own post-secondary education, and they have to come to the band office and apply for funding, we can say, no, post-secondary education is only for citizens or members in good standing. Denied. We could say to Grace that we're denying any other benefits. They can't be treaty rights. So maybe if you run, here's a good one, if you run a food fishery. So my community, we have a food fishery, so I don't have to go through the challenge or the difficulty of setting my own salmon nets. Because if you've never been a salmon fisherman, that's a lot of work, okay? And I don't really have that time or energy. So because we run a food fishery, I can just go over to fisheries and say, can I have a salmon? And as a band member, I'm entitled to have salmon. There's a quota that each of us gets, but it's my right as a member of the community to say, can I have that? But fishing is a treaty right. So if I was not in compliance, my band could just as simply say to me, Roxanne, you're no longer eligible to use the food fishery. You have to go catch your own salmon. And let me tell you, that'd be a lot more difficult for me. So you could look at non-essential services. There have been some First Nations who've even suspended access to daycare because daycare is not a treaty right, it's a non-essential service. So you have to first look at what are non-essential services and would we have the courage to deny them? Yes or no? And this is bigger than the housing policy because that's now a governance decision that has to be made and the community has to be informed. If you were prepared to use outside resources, and some First Nations will, there's been more than one First Nation who has said we will hire a collection agency to go out and collect our bad debts. I'm not a big fan of that personally, only because collection agencies, they will keep the majority of the money that they collect. They also will be incredibly ruthless about this as they work in our communities. And I have always believed if we treat our people with respect and decency and attempt to negotiate a repayment agreement, we can resolve the issue. So I would try first a client counseling approach to say, how do we solve the problem? Will you sign a repayment agreement? And of course, that goes back to your policy. You need to have time-sensitive collection procedures that are swift and severe, and that we make no exceptions to the rules. So if it's Rose or if it's Frank or if it's Grace, it don't matter to me. It's an account that's in arrears and I'm coming after it. And that means you got to have staff. If you can do all of those things and try to avoid the eviction, it's always best to try and avoid an eviction. But make no mistake, at the end of the day, this is a business and we may have to. There's been a few First Nations who have had some success, and I'm not a big fan of this one either, about relocating a tenant. So they would say, Grace, you don't want to pay your rent in the Section 95 rental project, so we're going to move you over here to these old band units where you have no obligation to pay rent. The problem with that I have, though, is that it doesn't necessarily decrease any of our operating cost. It just moves her into a home where she doesn't have a financial obligation. But that doesn't really change the band's relationship. So I'm not a big fan of relocating. There have been some bands who've even used the provincial courts where they've registered bad debts in the courts. Doesn't guarantee that you'll get your payment back, but it does guarantee that you just made Grace's credit rating a little bit more difficult for her. Because, you know, there's nothing worse than Grace who won't pay her rent and she drives by the band office every day in a brand new truck and flips me the bird. I hate that. As we all know it happens, right? I mean, tell the truth, you know?
Another question here.
Hi. My question is, if a community has a new housing policy and things like that.
Absolutely. I think, you know, one of the first things I would do with a brand new housing committee, and it's going to sound really crazy, so humor me for a minute, okay? About that kind of tour. I'm saying load them up on a school bus, drive them around the reserve, point to the latest project that you built and say to them, you see those 3 brand new houses over there? They're worth $600,000. Tell them about the debt financing that the band takes on to build houses in our community. If you have multiple projects, drive by your apartment building and say that's worth $2.5 million, houses 12 of our band members, the average rent that we charge is this, the kind of property management challenges that we have is this. Really show them your community from a housing perspective. So they need to know, first of all, I always believe that people need to remember the housing committee in this case is supporting a nonprofit housing business. They need to understand the dollars and cents that are at play. They need to understand the responsibilities. I would give them all a copy of the housing policy. I would definitely train them on the housing policy. And I would train them on all the programs and services. So you might start with inviting, if you have any CMHC programs, invite your CMHC First Nation consultant to come out and speak to the housing committee at one of their future meetings. If you use any lenders, invite your lender to come out and talk about the band's lending programs. If you have insurance on the homes, maybe bring your insurance company out. You know, you don't have to do this all at once either. You can do one topic at a time with each of their meetings. You should also think about training them on things like planning of future projects. Looking at what their role is going to be in housing and what support or guidance do we need to give the housing committee to do that. And on the first part of your question was, is a new housing policy? I always have to remind people that policies aren't treaties. We can change a policy so easy. It is our decision within our community to change a housing policy. And if it's a brand new policy, I can tell you right now, it will change. There are people in this room who have excellent housing policies, and what makes them excellent is they keep making it better. So in the world of housing policy, we should all aspire to good, better, best, so that that policy never gets stagnant. You know, your community will change, your policies and procedures need to change to stay current with that. And with a new policy and a new committee, you might even now start planning an evaluation of both. 1 year from now to evaluate, does the policy work, does the committee work, and what areas of improvement are there? Yes. You know, I'll tell you honestly, I agree with you, but there are other housing experts who disagree with me, and you know, that's their right to disagree with me. I think I'm right and you're right, so that's okay. And the reason I think we're right is because each program has a different objective. Each program has a different target audience. So if we have one housing policy and we try to deal with both market-based housing and, you know, affordable housing together, it's not the same program. The responsibilities between us and the occupant are different depending on the tenure, depending on their financial obligations and our obligations. So I believe there should be a housing policy for rental units, and some of those rental units might be Section 95, they might be band owned, there might be a policy on market-based housing, there should be a home ownership policy, there should be a renovation and repair policy, and I would even take it a little bit further to say, not in all communities, but in some communities, there's a need to have an elders policy. If we treat elders differently, whatever that might mean in your community, then you need to have a policy to govern that and guide that. And another one that's emerging a lot is maybe we should all have policies on emergency repairs. you know? So there's a lot of policy development that needs to happen. Earl?
One of the challenges First Nations are facing, and it's come to us many times, is the whole issue of land tenure. Sometimes it's written in the policy, sometimes to get just to own the house, not the land. Others swear by certificates of possession. Others will go to a lease under that arrangement. And then you have this whole federal sort of matrimonial real property sort of legislation that's forcing them to look at, now we're talking about splitting the assets and all of that kind of stuff. Have you had to deal with the whole issue of land tenure in your dealings with First Nations?
Not directly. I mean, land tenure comes up, of course, everywhere we go, and people are talking about it, and especially if you're looking at market-based housing and home ownership, you're going to need to resolve the issue of land tenure. So, I mean, while we encounter it, we talk about it, we work with a lot of First Nations on their housing policies and procedures, and just a couple of basic things. I mean, we could spend an hour and a half on the topic of land tenure, maybe next year. And but you know, just in a nutshell, and I am watching the clock, Grace. I notice she's getting closer to me. You know what that means, eh? I'm aware of what this means. So just quickly on the issue of land tenure, regardless of what you're doing, if you're building a brand new home and the band member comes to you and they have some form of land tenure, just a gentle reminder, they should surrender that back to the band before you start any new construction. Whether it's going to be a rental unit, whether it's going to be a rent-to-own unit, or even in this case, if it's going to be a home ownership unit and you hold the guarantee, you need to make sure the band is protected. So I would ask them to surrender the land back to the band with the understanding and an agreement that we would return them their parcel of land as we received it when they have satisfied all the conditions of the agreement. So that would be the mortgage or the rental agreement, whatever the case may be, then we would return it back to them. But, you know, personally, I think it's an interesting topic because if we're asking people, especially in market-based housing, if we're asking people to go the distance and to pay off that home and to accept the responsibilities of that home, they are going to need some assurance that it is going to be their home. And they're going to need an assurance that they, as a homeowner, will have the privilege and the rights to decide what happens with their home in the future. Whether that is they sell it to another eligible person who can afford to buy the home and who can accept the responsibilities of the home, or whether they choose to move off reserve and rent out their home, or whether they choose to give their home to a family member. That becomes their choices, so the issue of land tenure must be resolved. And a lot of us in this room, and I'm looking at some of you, and I know a little bit about your stories, a lot of First Nations have already been burnt on the issue of land tenure because the band did not have the land surrendered back to us before construction. Many of us have people right now who are living in a home, the band owns the home, the tenant does not make their payments on the home, yet the home is sitting on a piece of CP land. We got to stop that. You know, because it's very difficult for us to enforce the policy. I mean, it only leaves you with the option of the big truck solution. Let's take the house off the land. That's a housing humor. It doesn't work well. So don't everybody get excited about, that's not a consequence either, Grace. Okay, any other questions? I think we might have time for one more question. All right, let's see. I came in this room early this morning. Well, not that early, but earlier than all of you. And I put underneath 3 chairs a little piece of paper that says free t-shirt. So flip over your chair, please only your chair, not the one someone's sitting in. You can check any empty chairs if you're so obligated. And when you find it, come on up here and I'm going to give you a Turtle Island t-shirt.
There's one.
Thank you. Holy. Come on, there's 2 more out there. All right, Teresa.
Oh, there's number 2.
Come on up. There's 1 more in the room, and it was at the back of the room.
Is that it? 1, 2, 3?
One more.
Oh,
Wow, nobody found it? Interesting. Nobody found the third one?
no?
Okay, so let's
Well-
see. Nobody found it, eh? That's interesting. Oh, no, it's not a piece of tape. It's a piece of paper that
tape.
says a free T-shirt. All right, so let's have a little contest in here. Is there anybody in the room who's ever been evicted over non-payment of rent? Or got a notice? Oh, geez, that would have been... doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Nobody, or you're not going to tell me the truth, eh? Okay, who in the room paid their rent this month? Oh, too many of you. Okay, a lot of you. Wow, that's never happened to me before. Okay, let's see. Let's try something else. Who never won at bingo? You know, oh my God, we give you a prize. Come on up here. We'll give you the prize. Come on up. You've lost your culture. That's okay.
Go help set up when I was a kid.
Oh.
Church bingo.
You know, I used to be a bingo caller. It was my first job, bingo caller, and I wasn't very good at it. All right, I would like to thank you all very much for spending some time with me this morning. I am doing another session in this room, and it's about converting housing tenure, and we're referring specifically to what do you do when the mortgages are up on some of your existing units? What happens now? So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. I would just like to thank the conference organizers who every year bring me back, and CMHC who every year continues to sponsor my involvement. So thank you very much, all of you, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference. Thank you very much.